Pretty dark. 2016, I was in prison for weed stuff. I'd been arrested shortly before the elections, like a couple days before the Halloween, even just right before or shortly after. It's hard to remember because of the trauma. But in Israeli prison on an election day or moment, 2016, the consensus of the guards and the gangsters who were, all the inside hierarchies, was they all agreed. Tremendous relief and joy. Woohoo. It was kind of a boys' scene, not a lot of humanistic sort of rhetoric or vibes and the sort of, want to say macho hope. And I want to, for a second, acknowledge elections as having very traditionally been around November in a lot of places and installations, if not the elections, because of the condescension of Scorpio, which is an ascent, I want to say, which is an ascent and expression of. Me and my wife have a long intuitive disagreement about how much we love or fear Scorpios, which is just quick change, but from the wet instead of from the dry. Let's not make anything complicated, This is about accessibility and having a sense of what's actually going on any level, to whatever degree, in any sense. Tonight was not remotely about Gaza. It was mostly about inflation from 2 years ago and a general anti-incumbent environment globally, is what my cousin, the incisive and always very informed Joshua Block. And I want to agree, sure, except as much as there's impact to and fro in terms of like narratives and organizing. Like, yes, you're right. But I think the global pretty party, the global sense of concern for the impact, as opposed to the global hope of more impact, the collective will to check in and take care of each other and listen, is very bound up in the will not to. I remember an epic preschool tendency, which was the Great War in preschool, I would say age 4 or 5, in the backyard during the free time. All of school is so structured, now we're going to take a nap. Now we're going to play with this particular sand or marker. But the unsupervised time in the backyard, for some reason, devolves quickly or expresses itself overtly as a conflict between the good team and the bad team. I don't know if this is still true. I don't know if there's been inroads into sort of controlling the schoolyard thing, the war between good and bad. The boys were the bad team, and the girls and the good boys, the good identified boys, were on the good team, And I couldn't imagine wanting to be in the bad team. That seemed like crazy because I had already really been deep He-Man pilled from just, the hope of doing good. That was the goal, and that like bad was bad, really seemed like teaming up with the girls was the only thing that made any sense. And why would anyone identify as bad? Why would anyone want to be the bad team? What kind of psychos are these boys? And I think that question really answers itself elementally in the first schisms between Mars and Venus, between the sun and the moon, between the failure polarity that gives way to the Babylonian monomyth, right? Where it really is something about Demuzi that makes Inanna so angry that they have to switch places. Her retroactive Scorpio rage, keeping in mind that the tail of Scorpio is Hera's tool. Part of the resentment resistance complex expressing itself in reaction to the cold, as opposed to the, March version, the full Aries, Aries, the month so Aries identified, it's called Aries, as opposed to Scorpio, which is really very Mars disassociated, in that the cold and the wet are such a different thing. Ad kadei kach, that I think a lot of modern astrology like to associate with Pluto. And Pluto is so distinct from Mars, really not very much like Mars at all. So much so that, Heraclitus famously identifies Pluto with Saturn. You say a older, darker aspect within Mars, in the same way that Uranus is an older, darker aspect within Mercury. And I want to acknowledge how much Mars and Mercury is very much the split between Jacob and Israel. Israel is Mars. Judah is associated with Aries traditionally, but Jacob is Mercury, Jack Rabbit, just getting by mostly by avoiding the conflict, as opposed to Israel, which in its definition, in its original Esav meeting context, is by having confrontation, being willing to engage. And the bulwarks that solidify identity and solidify the right to insist, let's say, literal bulwarks, are part of the problem that nationalism aspires to rally through some kind of aspirational, pretentious ethos, or not, or rather the opposite. Slavoj Žižek pointed out a sad truth for the psychonauts, for the psychedelic sort of Reich heads, that Wilhelm Reich was Wilhelm wrong about Hitler. In that, and this is still, I think, a popular misperception, it's not a father figure that they're so into. Elon Musk, try as he may to father, is not a father figure. Donald Trump, his appeal is not the thought of him as an actual dad. It's uncle. This is Slavoj Žižek's big criticism of Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich, famously, is really the most liberated avatar of Freud, avoiding Jung's occultism problem by commitment, but still finding a language for somatic esoterica, how it feels. And in this way, Wilhelm Reich is very much trying to overcome the fiat of Mars and of the aggressive patristum. No. A softer way is therapy itself. And so Reichian therapies are very much about softening. Softening by any means necessary. That is the Reichian model, a neo-Reichian model. But whatever the problem of the stiffening of the worm is, it's more bound up in the uncle-brother encouragement than in the sort of father law. Osiris is the father, but Mars is not a father, even if he is. Mars is a bro. And I want to talk right now about the implications of this bro thing in Israel and in Brooklyn. In Israel, it's a great concern how much worse this kind of thing could be. And this is not a reason not to criticize from the left. It's an acknowledgement of how much the left hasn't been able to really exist or express itself as much as temper the other enthusiasm. And there's something very natural about this, right? The other enthusiasm nationalism, fascism ultimately, to some degree identifies as a creative force. As to the main curse of it is the degree to just co-ops, but to the degree that it identifies itself as pride in the self rather than a tempering element, chesed and not gevura, to the degree that the right and its excesses, this has always been within the Kabbalah of the 10 spheres, why Netzach, which is violence, which is domination, which is eternity, which is sort of the first expression of the self for the sake of itself, and thus the beginning of the problem of violence and injury and hurt in the world, is from the right and is an ironic expression, the right leg as opposed to the right arm, of the fundamental nature of expression, and thus sort of charismatically overwhelming. Netzach is also a conductor, is also Menatseach, just getting it out there, for the sake of what you need to express, which is the mansplain tendency that aspires, no, to really be bridging something, but instead is only heard as the sound of its own imposition, because that is how it's functioning. But acknowledging that is already the next thing. Hod and empathy are more bound up in gvura. And this is one of the reasons the left is so priestly, very much about peace within itself to whatever degree, and thus challenged by ever overimposing on the aggressive tendency, which really has come to identify itself with itself. And when that's inverted, I dare say historically it's been worse, because then one has a priestly ruling power that does not realize its own insensitivity. Perish forbid, chas v'shalom. At the worst moments of, say, bureaucratic superimposition. But now it really does seem and feel like it's going to be a problem out of control. And I think we need to address for a second how much that really seems true and how much that is the organizing noise. Because just like polling doesn't quite reflect reality, the organizing concerns that either side have cannot really represent the genuine danger of the other side. They can only represent the speakable, acknowledgeable consensus concern around and in relationship to the other side. The other side. And I really want to acknowledge how much the other side is bad and worse. By definition, that's what the other side means, in Kabbalah. The other side just means bad itself. And it is a euphemism for how much the whole thing is one continuous project with, I dare say, one continuous self-identity, which is why even in diasporas, we still keep talking like this matters. It does. And not just for reassociated reasons, how it impacts Israel and the Jews, but because of the larger sense of whole continuum that is the world thing, the market, that we all meet in or don't meet in. I don't know how much worse what's happening can get here in terms of us and what we do. Specifically, don't get me wrong, we can all imagine how much worse it can get as far as, sudden weapons we didn't expect, chas v'shalom, sudden attacks we didn't expect, chas v'shalom. I still think part of the mystery of October 7th is how much of a surprise it was. Or was it part of some kind of organized strategy like organized strategies are? And this is an argument I've heard within the right. It's a mystery who's on board for what and when. It does seem like they keep founding stuff suggesting a larger plan, like Hezbollah really was supposed to be more involved. There really were tunnels and things ready to go. There was just a communication breakdown of some kind for some reason. And I wonder if we'll ever know how much. I'm glad for how much we know what happened with the US and Iran in the 1950s. It would be impossible to know how much the US and England got together to disrupt Iran's democratic process in the 1950s, except now we know. So that's great that we know, but I wonder if we'll ever know, if we'll ever have a parallel Freedom of Information Act for how much and who knew anything here. We don't have that for Germany under the Nazis. They burned it. But here's what we can start to notice. Does more privilege tend to create more abuse? It does, right? It does. But does that give way to a full construction ambition, full annexing of Gaza and maybe even southern Lebanon for development purposes, either something like the settlement project or something not like the settlement project, as far as a more complete annexation, which could include naturalization of people living there, which I think is more likely in southern Lebanon, ironically, just because of the Druze, or something more like the settlements, which is an ongoing state of, what the kids never stopped calling occupation, just because those people can't vote. And if they could, it wouldn't be occupation. A lot of the reigning conceit about Gaza, right, in Israel, by us, was that it was independent, that was not an occupation or a concentration camp. That is the reigning conceit out here, but that's actually just what they did with the autonomy they were given. And we can't quite necessarily objectively know how much of the Gaza project was designed to collapse and break down, except by sort of looking over the pieces of it. And even then, it sure is easy to see afterwards how much Gaza was designed to be a powder keg that would explode and then be a convenient excuse to prove how much we can do and to let the other parallel forces prove how much they can do too. And this proving game is the place where I think sports veil and reveal something like what global media, global power management and negotiations are and seem to be. Just a question of who's allowed to express themselves and how much. Right? Let's say if October 7th had not been penalized as viciously and aggressively and inhumanely as it was, what would the message be to parallel aspirational chaos forces? Worth a try, you might be able to pull it off. And this is one of the fundamental hopes in the global revolutionary narrative, is that you really could, get people together and they finally do it, just like they did all those other times. Get together, become a country, represent themselves, push out the invader. It's really sad how bad Yugoslavia got because of how much it feels like the precedent in Israel is not towards anything as unitive or unificative as has ever happened, and as we kind of need to happen, because I really can't help but feel like the only long-term answer in this region is a all-encompassing democracy, not a more limited one, is one that includes everyone, specifically at least 1 million more Arabs, if not more. If we could get all of Gaza to become citizens of Israel, we might have something that could become genuinely functionally democratic, as opposed to just stable. But maybe I'm wrong, and that's impossible. I want to talk about the parallel challenges and possibilities of the impact in America, which I only experienced through Brooklyn, because of the refugees coming in. Too much of Satmar loves Trump because of the encouragement. And when those start to become conflicts, which so far they have managed to completely not quite be conflicts, haven't they? But as soon as it does, I think we're seeing the limited power and will of representation to push anything back. And I wonder how much the opposite can be the joy and privilege of the next 4 years. Let's say being a refuge state, being a refuge populace, finding a way out of the instinctive blame of the refugee that I think the right tends toward within the self and outside. I wonder how much that can be the work and orientation. I wonder how much it's an option versus the disaster of slashed federal funding. And I want to tell you guys about my dad, which I fall back on in the absence of accomplishments. My dad was a lawyer for poor people in North Brooklyn for many years, from the late 60s until the early 2000s, late 2000s, I should say late 2000s. And part of the historical challenge of running the whole thing was when Reagan got elected. That was the end of federal funding for what was fundamentally a federal project, one that functioned to offset the natural exploitation of the hierarchy that had been established in Brooklyn, where racism was the rule. Illegally, according to New York law, but practically and unenforcedly because of the need for budgets for lawyers to enforce what landlords will conveniently ignore. I'm telling you guys now, landlords have started using these strategies again and will, the more they know that it's not enforced, anything but what they have agreed upon. And that is part of the secret terror of not just Eric Adams, but really anyone whose deal is really more with development and developers, which is the main curse of the settlement project and blessing, development, housing. The YIMBY NIMBY thing acknowledges how much people just need to live somewhere. And the big disagreement is how much responsibility means closeness or distance. I hope, and this is and was the classic hope of the escalationists, that at least in the wake of not having been able to inspire Michigan and Pennsylvania correctly, that better organizing continue to happen, that we return to our true social networks and personal uncompromised tools of community and just get better at taking care of each other. Because like Jeepers Creepers, the main problem is only who else is suddenly lionized to express themselves and their brutality. Part of the real impact is just the people who know that they don't have accountability. And part of the question, let's say, as far as the immediate or long-term moral to draw is, where does that even come from? Like Kamala had no range of degree to which she could have been harder on Israel or softer on Israel, right? Because there are all those pro-Israel Democrats, which I appreciate living in Israel and having grown up in the democratic cradle. There must be a language of accountability that can be allowed to organize around more effectively. And the tendency to replace the language, which I think is one of the lasting legacies of the ADL, right? The tension between controlling a discourse and being victim to it has never quite been a winning tendency. As a kid, in the context of comics, we saw it with Frank Miller. the sword Frank Miller fell on and falls on to this day is the one of openly saying all the terrible things. And he has not done well in the industry because of it. I don't think Holy Terror did so great. I'm sure it has its own distribution network. I don't think his 300 sequel was quite as well receivable, despite embracing the mythical conceits of Judaism, which I thought was kind of cool. You know, just running with identifying Ahasuerus completely as Xerxes, specifically in his Xerxes, and Amestris as Esther, which I guess makes like Mordecai into her like head uncle guy, like Janos or something. He had a lot of names, that guy. For a second, I want to, in the hopes of having some perspective at all, because a lot of how I retreat into Kabbalah and esotericisms can only be in the hopes of understanding the real and the practical in the context of the precedent of mechanical structures of 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, just thesis, antithesis, synthesis, negation of the negation. And then the hope of a fifth thing after that, which is the conceit of both, like, say, the post-Passover Seder messianism of like the fifth cup and the fifth estate, that fifth empire, you know, the fifth kingdom that was the British Empire's self-identification as a sort of resolution to the problem of the tetragrammaton as history, where the fourth hay is the most disappointing. Much like the fourth book of the 5 books of Moses, where the end of the fourth book is so disappointing that they can't really make movies out of it. And so it can't cross over into pop. It's itself been rejected. Hence the fifth book, which tries to be more quotable and has a nice song in it, but the songs are actually very dark. That book of Deuteronomy. But it attests how important processing the impact of things are as the only blessing and the only reality win it. You know, the thumb, the fifth, that is the resolution to the 4, the kaf, that is the resolution to the yud, is the conclusion. Davar halamed me'inyano, a thing is learned from its context. And all wisdom is only knowledge of things from their context, i.e., from memory, from the beginning of where we know them from. When Alexander of Macedon, right? Greece we identify as the synthesis, but Persia as the initial antithesis to Babylon. Daniel becomes the king of Persia. They start building their temple. Darius is Messiah, you know. I mean, like Koresh. And then the whole family is sort of, you know, the messianic family until forever. You know, Koresh rules with you. And that is the messianism of Persia and Madai, right? Brought together, Paras and Madai, as one thing, not called Babylon, but together in Shushan, in Susa. In the long term, Iran and Israel are going to have to come together because it really is one united block over here, as opposed to the predatory secularism of Far Asia, the Dajlal that I think Islamic apocalypticism has been much more prepared for so long, since it's always appeared to be a much more terrifying dragon emerging out of the East, because they've had so much more precedent and so much more cohesion, you know? Cohesion. As much as the hope of justice, on the other hand, right? The East will bring us socialism after all. I don't know. Until Asia embraces psychedelia, hard not to be scared of them and their justice. Put us back to work. This is a certain kind of unexpressed apocalypsism. Unexpressed, I mean, in that it does not conveniently sit on the mythology established in the book of Daniel and thereafter, which is tetragrammatical. Tetragrammatical. Babylon is Yud, Persia is He, right? Babylon is the initial phallic violence, isn't it though? Ironically, in the name of Istahar, whatever. And Persia, everyone knows, is the first He. Queen Esther, and the sensitivity to invite a more integrated way that functions as authentically good, let's say. Let's say the accomplishments of Quraysh and the Qurayshi way of Zoroastrian, Persian, cosmopolitan, universalism, let's say, give way to the patristic violence of reason inherent in the Greek model, the entire Hellenism, which is the Vav, the Vav below, the Vav, which is truth and which is really, I think, the refinement of patristic violence into philosophy, as the Phoenician Pan Aramaic language is cohered into, ironically, again, something, a vessel for the mythologies that had been so ingrained in the human reactive tendency project. Hence the 7 stars. Let's be honest, Mars and Venus are not new things. They're probably inherent in the beginning of pre-existence. I don't know, pre-existence. All the polarities that became the main language for religion, astrology, and thus philosophy, because Hesperus is Venus after all, coherent to the core priorities that they've used those things to talk about for as long as they've noticed them. And they got them down to 7 because these 7 are pretty huge as fortifying technicians, even cognitively. This is part of the story. Because the challenge of relating to our politics and our idolatries is the challenge of perspective. We just really appreciate the relief until we don't. And then we need a language about expressing and organizing around the danger of appreciating our relief until that feels silly because a different thing is the problem. And this is the pace and challenge of the satires. Jacob is always doing satires. Israel is engaging. And the concern is that license to engage will only lead to atrocities. And I think at this point, now that it's out of control, like a man in prison, hoping that something other than the forms of resistance can be the tools of resistance and at least survival, endurance, might be what happened. And this is a very ancient disagreement between the Mars tendency in the self, which does not like to give up or compromise under any circumstance, and the Venus aspect, which only wants to give up and compromise for the sake of just the embrace and the comfort. I don't think it's easy to run a full Venus candidate. I think Kennedy was the last full Venus candidate was run an American election because the offense and resentment and defense mechanism against that comfort is so ingrained. It made Sarah Palin easy to dismiss. It made everyone else easy to dismiss. It's not what they went for with Kamala because they didn't want her to be threatening to her base. They wanted her to be serious, and accessible and comforting, but rallying, but organizing. But gosh, Selena Myers just looks so uncomfortable, doesn't she? Like and I wonder how this will change the politics in New York City and Brooklyn specifically. Because how much can the accommodationist model adapt to the welcomeness of the aggressivenesses that are going to come, which include, I want to say, the good ones, the good ones. Historically, the Democratic Party has been very good at using disasters to fundraise. But I think people have caught on to that now. And I don't think it's going to work as much, except to the degree that the money itself will have to organize under some kind of rubric. And the Democratic Party is the closest thing to an accessible rubric. I wonder how much the investor class of federalism, Hollywood, go Lakers, I wonder how much there can be a reassessment industrially. I want to acknowledge the impact culturally of the 2016 election in that the best television shows were launched and canceled very early. Powerless was an amazing moment of the industrial Warner Brothers vehicle producing a comic book universe in universe show with Abed from Community and just the wave meant you couldn't tell those stories so much. You couldn't expect them to do well or be anything but depressing or the other reasons things get shut down. I wonder how different the pivot in the investor class is with media, with a capacity to identify with a more authentically left position. And I suspect part of the challenge and problem is going to have to be coming up with a more actionable left center position about Israel from Brooklyn. I think that is part of the work that no one is prepared for. And I wonder if ironically would come from the right itself, an authentically actionable left position, center left position, because it has to be accommodating to the right tendencies within the left, defense, a core commitment to anti-Semitism that just can't really experience Zionism as so different from any other nationalism. As far as a center left emerging position from Brooklyn about Israel, what can just be acknowledged might have to be more of the work. And what acknowledgement makes accessible might be the comfort in Israel. I'm concerned only that we will misunderstand how little support there really is once we start to take support for granted. Let's say a lot of the fun of the surprise could be Trump pivoting just towards Putin against Ukraine and Israel, unless Israel just, makes some different gestures and Bibi ends the war on Gaza and Lebanon, but for Putin, right? Doesn't that sound like an easy pivot? And then Bibi is celebrated as the guy who brought peace, gets a Nobel Prize successfully, puts dairy and pushes the whole thing to the side. I don't know what's going to be up with Nobel Peace Prizes. How low is the bar now? The rumor is it was going to end like in another month or so anyway, but I wonder if a Kamala win would have meant Israel would have pressed harder, the Golan firing more leaned into as the alternative to blah, blah, blah. I wonder what's going to happen with that firing, if there's going to be pushback and maybe just like, okay, fine, accommodation now that the carte blanche and the threat of encouragement to do more hyperviolence or abandonment to the other people's hyperviolence will or will not be the tendency and reaction. Hard not to feel like human rights in Iran are not necessarily going to be very protected. And I wonder how much the plan is to rally together the specific repressive elements, or will the conflict between the specific repressive elements become the big conflict and they can then target each other? in whatever way, to whatever degree, from whatever distance. Eric Adams, right? Hard not to feel like he's out of trouble now and he's just going to get pardoned. And hard not to feel like the danger of that is the danger of the repression of the progressive element in New York City. But I don't know how progressive his opposition really is or was. They were basically his people that he sort of just cut off, right? I don't know if you guys know Brooklyn politics relative to New York City politics at all. Lincoln Ressler was a big part of Eric Adams' office, but it sounds like he stopped talking to him, stopped taking his calls, doing something on a different scale. Maybe organizing with Turkey is how we get independence and autonomy from the local structures, but maybe that's not a great reason to do it. But maybe the FBI coming after you is a sign that you're doing something genuinely autonomous, but maybe that's really bad because it's not great for politicians to have autonomy from accountability locally. But what will they sacrifice in order to have the autonomy they're asking? Cuomo, to not have to deal with lawsuits, gave us legal weed, made the bodega scene really nice for a year and a half before the federalism's caught up. How much is this tension between the privilege and comfort of being allowed to just do whatever you're doing versus the comfort of accountability after all? How can it reemerge? I'm expecting private alternatives to federal services, but this is really the biggest threat of all to the federal service, which means they may just try a little harder next time, and try a little harder locally, and or just be co-opted and abandoned, forcing other mechanisms to emerge. I don't know, man. If there's one thing I definitely don't know or understand, it's how the FBI rolls. They sure like to take their time. And they probably could have done better over here in this election by somehow rallying under a more genuinely left platform, not left candidate. I think part of the takeaway actually is that Kamala was great and she just didn't have much to work with as far as what she would be allowed to claim to believe or valorize. Why did she have to publicly support fracking? Did that lose more than we can fathom in Michigan and Wisconsin, just publicly supporting fracking? Not that Trump is against fracking, but he might just let RFK defend something or something or something, right? Might just be a little different than the pending doom I think people experience, fictively or not, from the abandonment of the larger industrial federal machine of public resources being accessible. If the Democratic Party can't figure out how to action values and priorities close to the base will just give up and do other things. And it's sad to think about how much that's what happened in this election, and really kind of a mystery. Did she try too hard? Not hard enough? Was she not right-wing sounding enough? It's really hard to imagine that was the problem. I think once you got Liz Cheney on board and using words like lethal, playing with guns, and basically supporting Israel somewhat unconditionally, but not in a way that they can acknowledge, because unconditionally, enthusiastically. I wonder if there was a way to do both things. I wonder what can cohere next. And I think the problem of history is the precedent is so dooming, where you can't really expect a center to hold if it keeps moving one way. And as much as the revealed priority of the populace is another way, you really do need to just jump on those trains and live on those trains. But this is not true because that's not a thing people know how to do. I was very struck by Bill Clinton. Can I tell you stories about my childhood experience with Bill Clinton, right? A kind of proved that accusations of misogyny and sexual assault shouldn't be taken seriously. Forget about that. I was in a Jewish day school choir in eighth grade, come to sing a few really specifically progressive sounding, but only in Hebrew, so they wouldn't know how progressive sounding they were, songs before the President of the United States of America. I remember being struck that he was there, not with his wife on his arm, but with one of the Bronfman daughters, just in the crowd, singing along joyfully with his whole heart to the Pledge of Allegiance, listening to us sing like three songs. La Yisagai El Goy Cherev La Yimadu Od Milchama La Yisagai El Goy Cherev La Yimadu Od Milchama. You know this one? La Yisagai El Cherev Lo Yilmadu Od Milchama Lo Yisagai El Cherev Lo Yilmadu Od Milchama. They actually changed the lyrics for our performance to President Clinton to be from Hey Lo Yisagoy El Goy Cherev Lo Yilmadu Od Milchama to, for some cool reason having to do with how we sounded as a choir. Shout out to Mr. Nobman. I don't know where he is, but he seemed to have a plan where it was Yo Lo Yisagoy El Goy Cherev Lo Yilmadu. Ooh. Don't throw another people onto the sword. Don't learn another war. And we sang that song and a few other songs that were sort of similarly themed. I think Mashiach song. Gets up to speak, the president of the United States of America at the time, in a hotel, a nice hotel, Manhattan, and pledges to finally sanction Iran and stop selling them weapons. And we're like, okay, that's very nice and encouraging, a ritual sacrifice to us, but we were selling weapons to Iran that whole time. This was the year that I learned that actually Israel was selling Iran weapons until like 1984, even while keeping, some of those banks and accounts tight since 79. I think the best hope is that we just get better at noticing each other and noticing each other not only in a predatory, opportunistic way, but also in a genuinely inspired, empathetic, and hopeful way, because that has always only been the hope that we wouldn't want to kill each other or impose on each other anymore. And this is the great hope for the end of misogyny, right? Not just that we'll police what's platformed and punish what's warned, not just that, but that genuine empathy and listening would be possible and made. And the problem with politics is we don't know how to communicate without being imposing and imposing aggressively. The things we organize around are the things we see most ignored about. Hence the need to organize aggressively around an army, I'm so sorry for how much worse anything's going to be for anyone but me, personally. As a kid, I don't think we ever stopped being worried about who could be blamed for anything. Refugees, Jews. And just as quick, really tried to find who to blame, for everything. I wonder what taking responsibility can be. One thing I noticed when I was in prison in 2016, an Israeli prison, what are people in prison for is just trying to take a little too much responsibility for their lives. And the whole struggle of politics is really a lot about what the standards are going to be for those machines already. לא יסגוי כל חרב, לא ילמדו עוד מלחמה, לא יסגוי כל חרב. חרב is a sword. לא ילמדו עוד מלחמה. מלחמה is a war. לא יסגוי אל החרב, לא ילמדו עוד מלחמה, לא יסגוי אל החרב, לא ילמדו עוד מלחמה.